Hi, I'm Jackie Miller, high conflict divorce coach and consultant, and host of this podcast, Out of Crazy Town, your guide to divorcing a narcissist. This episode is about stalking abuse during divorce. During a high conflict divorce, a disordered individual will often engage in stalking activities as part of the post-separation abuse. This is a serious issue that leaves victims nervous, scared, and sometimes fearing for their lives. I had the honor of interviewing both Randy McAlister, who is Deputy Director of Public Safety and Police Captain, as well as a task force officer with the FBI in threat assessment and threat management, along with Katie, who has been a victim of stalking during her divorce. Katie shares her story and how she has used threat assessment in her case. Join me as I speak to these two amazing individuals about this important topic. All right. Hello. Welcome to Out of Crazy Town, your guide to divorcing a narcissist. I am so excited to have guest Randy McAlister on the show today. Welcome, Randy.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And we also have a special guest, Katie, who's on, who is a victim of stalking as well in her high conflict divorce. And so Katie's going to chime in and tell us a little bit about her experience and how she got involved with Randy. But first, Randy, I want to tell folks a little bit about you. It's very hard to introduce you. And I'm going to tell you why. Randy's curriculum vitae reads like a novel. So we have the most experienced gentleman on the show that we could possibly have for this topic. So let me just tell you a little bit about him. He's currently the Deputy Director of Public Safety and Investigative Police Captain. And that is at the Cottage Grove Police Department, correct, Randy? Outside of Minneapolis? Okay.
Yeah, near Minneapolis.
Near Minneapolis. Okay. Now, you are also the owner and founder of the McAlister Threat Management company, where you provide training and case management consultation services in all areas of targeted violence and threat assessment. And then going back into your career history, you have been involved in the delivery of emergency services since 1990. So you've been sort of in the first responder role for a long time.
Yep.
As well as we're a former team commander on the county SWAT team, where you had specialized training in hostage rescue, civil disturbance, and executive protection, and then a lot of other stuff. But now you're a member of the Association of Threat Management Professionals and a certified threat manager. And if I understand correctly, you're one of the first people in the country to receive.
Yeah, I think one of the first 30 or 20, 24 or 30, something like that.
Okay. Very cool. And you're a national trainer on stalking, and you are a task force officer with the FBI in their threat assessment and threat management initiative, and designated threat management coordinator for the Behavioral Analysis Unit, otherwise known as the BAU. My daughters are going to be thrilled that I'm talking to you today because they're addicted to the show Criminal Minds.
I'm nowhere near as good looking as all those actors.
Oh, yes, you are. Yes, you are. They should cast you immediately. So that is why I know what the BAU is. That's my Hollywood. Yep. That's my Hollywood experience with the BAU. So thank you again for coming on. You're on this show because in the context of high conflict divorce, in my experience as a divorce coach and consultant, stalking has come up over and over and over again. And so I wanted to first, though, ask you, how did you end up here? Like in your extensive career, how did you end up in your threat management?
Yeah, actually, assessment? It was back in, I think it was 2006. I was a sergeant at the time. I was supervising a night shift here at Cottage Grove PD. And I was also a team leader for the county SWAT team. And it was in the middle of the night, and heard a call come out on the radio that there was a possible double homicide and a hostage situation in more of the rural county where I live. So I headed up. There's a SWAT guy, and long story short, it ended up being a domestic related stalking case where the offender shot and killed his former girlfriend and her new boyfriend. I didn't know anything about the case at the time, obviously, but reading, sort of paying attention to the news cycle after that, realized that it seemed like she was really trying to get help for this case for the year before it happened. And I just kind of started looking at research papers, really. What, is there a way to sort of predict if cases are going to be violent, whether it's a domestic violence call or whatnot? And so that led me into the world of threat assessment. And I think in 2010, I went to Gavin DeBecker and Associates Advanced Threat Assessment Academy in Lake Arrowhead, California. And that's when I joined the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals as well. So from 2010 on is when I really sort of started getting into this whole area of targeted violence, which includes stalking, among other things. So,
Well, and so the term threat assessment is so important because for folks that have been in a controlling relationship and now, so say it's marriage, in the context of this podcast, and now they've separated. Clearly there was, some abuse and very controlling behavior before, but once that separation happens, things get really dangerous, right?
right.
And the stalking can kick into high gear, or even, stalking behaviors show up that it didn't even exist, but now this person's lost control, right? And they don't know, they want to know where you are and what you're doing, and it can just escalate. And so for the victim, yes, we don't know where it's going to end, and so yes, having someone or a tool for law enforcement to assess what level of threat that is sounds brilliant. And so I'm so glad that you're here to talk about it. So what has your experience been, or what are your thoughts on the world of divorce and stalking or threat assessment?
Well, I mean, stalking happens so often. Some of the numbers are, and I'll let your listeners do the math, but if you take your population and divide that by 1,000, wherever you live, and then multiply that by 27, that's the rough number of actual stalking cases are occurring year to year in your jurisdiction.
Wow.
And it's almost universally undercharged and underinvestigated and just not recognized, right? And so there's so much of it out there, and it can be defined in various ways, and sort of each definition sort of adds something to the argument. But it's been called inappropriate pursuit. I think that's Gavin DeBecker's description in his book, The Gift of Fear, if you've ever read that.
Okay.
Obsessional following, pathological fixation, which means you're so fixated on your target that it starts to negatively affect your life in some way. It could be you're spending all your time on your fixation, that your work is going by the wayside, or your friends and family. Maybe you're burning through a lot of money as part of, in terms of spending that money on your stalking behaviors. So it's pathological in some way. And there's another one too, that's another definition where it starts with an emotional fixation and then ends up in some unwanted obsessional pursuit. I think all these definitions contribute something to our understanding, but they all boil down to there's some sort of obsession and then some sort of behaviors on the part of the offender that causes the target to feel oppressed, fear for safety or safety of friends or family members, or persecuted in some way.
Absolutely. And it affects the victim's behavior, because now you've, from what I've heard in my experience, that no longer, I don't want to go on my computer. I'm afraid to use my phone. I'm at the park with my kids and look up and he or she is standing across the street staring at me. It's, unwanted gifts being left. And so loss of sleep, looking over your shoulder, and it's just this whole world of living in paranoia.
Yeah, I mean, some victims end up feeling like they're prisoners in their own homes. And there's actually a study out of, I want to say it was South Florida a few years ago, that asked stalking victims to characterize sort of what they're going through. And the fear of not knowing where and if he's going to show up was actually worse than when he showed up, right? And that gets ignored in the criminal justice system a lot, I think, whether it's, police or prosecutors or judges. The sort of the emotional strain and the emotional trauma of just always wondering is kind of ignored when we look at charging these out and, convictions and things like that. So.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And Katie, I would like you to chime in, because I'd like you to tell us what your situation was and, what kind of stalking abuse you've suffered.
Sure. Well, I'll try to summarize. First of all, I got connected with Randy. So I'm 3 years post separation, and my divorce is even finalized. And my former husband had the power and control issues during our marriage. And when we separated, his stalking, or I didn't even know what it was at the time, but I would say obsession was, I guess I couldn't even put a terms to what was going on. Acting as if we were still married, acting as if he's going to come back, acting as if I saw him again, I'd fall in love with him. And then started to harass my family and my friends. And it wasn't until just about 9 months ago that he began harassing my boss, trying to get her to stop being my friend, stop supporting me, and started to try to blackmail and exhort her and her family to get her to stop being part of my life, to isolate me. That she reached out to a friend of a friend, and that friend connected us to Randy. And so then Randy came into my life and did basically a threat assessment on my situation, read the writings, read my former husband's rantings and everything. And when he looked at my case and started giving me a framework in which to see what I was experiencing, it was two things. It was super validating because I was listening to the checklist of what a stalker is, and I could almost check off every single one of them. It was like mind blowing.
Wow.
And it was also terribly scary because it was the first time I couldn't be in denial about my situation, where I was like, okay, well, oh, he's not that bad. Oh, it's just this. That's how I survived my marriage. It's just complete minimization of my situation, so I wouldn't feel scared.
Sure.
And once I validated that, no, he is pathological in what he's doing, and there's nothing in place to make him stop, even though I have a 5-year DVRO, even though he's breaking court orders, there's no one listens. Or if they listen, they don't understand what to do with it. Like the police, they're doing their best they can, but I often get this, well, I've seen much worse. Like, well, you're not punched. Has he actually showed up? Did he actually hit you? Does he have a gun with him? And as opposed to actually hearing that this is, I guess, what we call a course of conduct, which I just learned recently, and how that he's very dangerous because of this obsession. And so, yeah, I have all of those symptoms. Like a bird hit the window the other day and I jumped out of my skin. I'll hear like a creak at night and I'll be like, oh no, I'll check all my cameras. And there's just these things where I'm like, well, hopefully he won't come over and hurt us. But it's just such a weird world to live in. And so that's why I'm so grateful to have vocabulary to put to my situation. And I hope other people will too.
That's a really good point, because it is more empowering that you feel like you have the vocabulary, because it means someone did some work to, like you said, validate what you went through and actually, took the time to label it and understand what it is. And so speaking of the assessment that you said Randy did, Randy, can you speak more to that and how that worked?
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of using, validated tools from the social sciences to make assessments. And one thing I'm a firm believer, my specialty is threat assessment and management. It really does no good or doesn't benefit many people to just do an assessment, say, well, you're high risk, right? And then not do any management stuff.
Sure.
Right. They go hand in hand. So, I use different tools depending on what kind of violence I'm looking at. In Katie's case, I used a screening tool called the SASH from Australia. And that's been through some studies overseas and found to pretty well separate your low risk cases from your high risk cases. In law enforcement, we get a lot of reports of harassment. And so you need to be able to triage them somehow, right?
Right.
Because we have limited resources. So, I use something like that to triage a case. And then in her case, then I applied the full tool, which is called the Stalking Risk Profile. And that's a structured professional judgment tool that requires some training. It's based on research. So the researchers have identified behaviors that are highly correlated with violence. It also looks at persistence, because that's the other part. There's violence, which everybody's concerned about, but then how long am I going to have to deal with this?
Right.
Is he going to be in the back of my mind for the next 5 years because he's just not knocking it off? So persistence is also assessed in this tool, and then reoccurrence if the stalking stops for like 6 months or longer, and then you want to get an idea whether it's being used for courts or victims or law enforcement. Do we have to be worried that this is going to start up again at some point? So I use tools as much as I can to eliminate biases I may have as a person, as a cop, whatever. So having a tool like this is really beneficial, and I think was really helpful in Katie's case.
Absolutely. Because I'm imagine, like you said, Katie, you go to the police and you're like, he's, you describe all these odd behaviors. And then you say he has, 7 guns and some of them are automatic, whatever you say. And they're like you said, they're like, our hands are tied. Has he done anything? Has he touched you yet? And so like you said, Ray, unless they have a tool to say, okay, no, this person, according to our assessments and falls clearly into this category based on this criteria, now maybe it can give them the tools to do something about it. And how do you plan to use this assessment in your case?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, our case is ongoing a little bit. And so this, I feel, is the first step to be heard in both the family court and criminal court. And then he did give me a management case procedures for both myself and the stalker. So for myself, I've looked at the management and am implementing it. Some of it is, I think, like cocooning, where you tell your family and friends what's going on and you give them the information and tell them to be on the lookout. Some of it is, having a buddy system. And I'm actually thinking about getting a dog. I've heard those are good support teams as well.
Sure.
So that's some of the things I'm hoping to do. But what I heard Randy said is like, how does it stop? And I think that's going to be one of our biggest questions going forward, because this person hasn't shown any desire to stop, nor has there been any big things to get him to stop, even with a DVRO. So that's just a big question mark in my case.
Sure. And so, Randy, you had asked or mentioned wondering how this information is going to be used. So speaking of court cases and specifically in divorce, how do you recommend people document their stalking?
Stalking is one of the few crimes where it really depends on the victim of the crime to build their own case, right?
Okay.
Because usually these behaviors that are associated with stalking are happening outside, any police involvement. And so you have to be a meticulous record keeper. I always recommend starting with a stalking log, and you can find free examples on the internet. The former Stalking Resource Center still has a website up and running, I believe, and still has a stalking log you can download. But go back to the first creepy or even assaultive behavior that sort of started everything.
Okay.
A lot of times you see, a lot of people are probably familiar with the power and control wheel that deals with domestic violence and how offenders control their partner. And you kind of touched on this earlier, Jackie, is that once there's a separation, now they've lost control. So they try to reassume control through stalking oftentimes, right?
Right.
And so anyways, so you want to really document. And the other thing is collect your evidence, especially in today's digital age. Get, screenshots of text messages, save your emails. And I would encourage your listeners who may be going through this to learn how to find full email headers for their emails, because that's going to provide the law enforcement with that path that email traveled to get to you with IP addresses and things like that. So that's going to be good evidence.
Okay.
Photographs. Everybody's got smartphones now. So if your stalker is engaging in what we call approach behavior, which is showing up at your house or your workplace or wherever, make sure you grab photos. In those photos is going to be metadata, which has date, time, oftentimes your GPS coordinates. And we can pull that with metadata readers, and that's great evidence.
Okay.
For billing your stalking case. Those are probably the biggest things are the stalking log and just learning how to collect all that digital evidence, because the vast majority of stalking cases now involve some sort of technology, right? Um,
Absolutely.
it's not like the olden days, like the movie Taxi from the 70s, where you actually have to show up and put a little more effort into it and actually
Yep.
park outside your target's place of employment or whatnot. Now a lot of it happens right from somebody's, basement. So um,
Absolutely.
it
I
good.
can't tell you how many clients I've sent to have their, computer swept and whatnot, and often found things. So you're absolutely right. Technology is definitely the new and popular way to stalk. So I want to ask you this, and then Katie, I want you to chime in with your experience. But Randy, when should victims be worried? Like, at what point do you say, "Oh my God, this has gone too
Yeah.
far"?
Well, I can tell you from like the stalking risk profile, there are 5 red flag indicators just from that tool. Um, Suicidal ideation on the part of the stalker, obviously. Any homicidal ideation or articulating homicidal threats, especially in domestic violence cases, is really important. Um, Last resort thinking.
Mm,
They start articulating ideas like, if I can't have you, no one can, or ideas of sort of running out of time or having to do something right away to get you back. Um, Putting wills together, those kinds of things.
okay.
Giving away important, talking about giving away important things, whether it's heirlooms or their car or whatever it is. Um, there's high risk psychotic phenomena, which gets sort of into the weeds. It's kind of helpful to have a mental health person maybe sit over your shoulder if you're using this for that reason. But that would include things like morbid jealousy, some hallucination, like command hallucinations to hurt people, those kinds of things. And then psychopathy is the last one. And psychopathy is sort of the extreme end of antisocial personality disorder, if you will.
Okay.
And there's an actual tool out there, the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, PCLR, that a lot of psychologists or psychiatrists are familiar with and trained on. So the presence of psychopathy especially in domestic violence stalking case is pretty concerning.
Okay.
So those things in particular, obviously, I also sort of separate stalking cases from, ones that just are using technology to ones that are actually approaching their target, right?
Okay.
So if he's actually physically showing up where you're at, that's obviously a lot more concerning for violence, because he typically can't hurt you if he's not near you. So as long as the stalking's just on text messages or emails, I'm less concerned for violence than if he actually starts showing up, kind of thing.
Sure. Absolutely. That makes sense. And so, Katie, at what point were you, for instance, like, I need to hire someone like Randy, or what were the sort of the straw that broke the camel's back?
Yeah, when it started turning to my community, to attempt to isolate me, to sway public opinion against me. And then there were long rants that, bordered some of these things. The first thing that got me to leave, 4 years ago, was suicidal ideation and homicidal ideation. And he quickly learned that that was not okay in public opinion, or to say it. And so ever since then, he's not been vocalizing those things, because people, took him seriously and thought him as a big threat. But you can see some of the other last resort thinking occasionally, when he might say things like, well, I don't care if I go to jail. And imagine seeing me at places I'm not. So he'll be like, oh, I saw you XYZ the other day. And we're like, no, that's not. So there was other things that were very concerning that made me think that, oh, this is not normal and I need help.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, you had alluded earlier to some things that you're sort of doing to keep safe, or some ideas. But Randy, what should people do or not do if they're in a stalking situation?
Yeah, and this is one that, and again, this is just my humble opinion. But I think there are a lot of other folks who are specialists in the stalking area would agree with these. When you're being, first of all, I mean, the safety things like cocooning, like Katie already talked about, There's also a proximity person. So somebody in your life you trust that knows where you're going to be somewhere and when you're going to be there. And so as you're traveling, whether it's to or from work or you're going out to a movie, that you're going to let that person know when you're home safe and when you're leaving, those kinds of things. So that's going to be helpful. But besides that, when you're being stalked through technology, like text messages or Facebook messages, I always tell people to not block the offender if you can. And I think there are 3 reasons, and I've had, 11 years of experience in this now, just really focused on stalking. And the 3 reasons for not blocking them are one, if you keep that line of communication open between him and you, you allow him to dig his hole in terms, legally speaking.
Yeah.
Right?
So you can document. Sure.
Yep. You're documenting more behaviors, and that's potentially building a stronger case for charging that when you need to. Number 2 is it gives you sort of a window into the soul or the thinking of the offender. I've had a lot of cases that have just been mostly text messages where the text messages have started out, relatively benign. I love you. I want you back. We're a family, those kinds of things. But they're expressing, a sense of loss and I want to get you back. But then right before, and unfortunately, some of these cases have ended up in homicide. And you can see right, in a day or 2 before the homicide, where the tone of the messages changes completely, from going from I love you to I hate you to you're tearing up our family. I wish you were dead. Those kinds of things. And you're going to miss that change in thinking if you block them completely. And then the last one is just if you block them, that could escalate the case actually. And we see escalation in, I don't know, 20% of the cases maybe when they're blocked.
Mm-hmm.
I've had cases that I have successfully investigated and gotten convictions on for felony stalking in my state, where it's clear that the blocking actually escalated things. One case in particular, my victim, when she did block him and from texting, he would start showing up at her house or her workplace. And so to manage that in her mind, she actually unblocked him, and then started communicating back. So he would send her text message and she'd respond. And that actually kept him at bay in terms of he wouldn't show up at her workplace anymore. So that was sort of a safety measure that she undertook and sort of intuitively knew that would work, and it did.
Yeah.
But yeah, if he realizes he's not communicating with you at all, you're not receiving anything, then a lot of times he's going to up the ante and start driving by, or he's going to find different ways to communicate with you.
Yeah. So. Then that's where you get the now showing up in person.
Right.
And yeah, that becomes a huge red flag. And that also leads back to why it's so important to document, just really detailed documentation, because I think we had this conversation before. Say the court looks at this and says, well, look, you're responding back and forth with him. What did you expect? And it really needs to be understood. No, that was strategic communication to keep him in a more calm state so that his
Right.
behavior didn't escalate. It was really a safety measure.
Right.
And so, yes, there's a lot of strategy that it sounds like.
Yeah. And, unfortunately, a lot of victims have to do that because a lot of times their stalking cases aren't taken seriously. Right.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
so in their minds, they're kind of out on their own. Nobody's helping them stay safe. So they're doing what they think they need to do to stay safe.
Sure.
That can be overcome in court if you have somebody who's experienced in stalking cases and investigations and behaviors and can explain that in their reports or explain that to the prosecutor, et cetera.
Sure. And so this leads me to my next question. Actually, you're one man.
Yep.
And I know you do a lot of other threat assessment in other areas in schools, whatnot, like lots of different
Yes.
arenas. What should people do? Should they go to their local police stations that ask, please get trained in stalking threat assessment? Like what can people do to like raise awareness?
Boy, that's a great question. I guess for one, work with if you're a victim of stalking is go to your domestic violence advocacy agency for one. That's probably a good place to start. they tend to have more training, obviously, in domestic violence and stalking and victim management and all that kind of stuff. One other thing is find out if there is an expert in your local police department. And don't get, I guess you have to be persistent. You may get assigned a patrol officer who clearly doesn't get it at first, but if you can ask around, you might be able to find a patrol officer or detective, somebody who's kind of known for an expertise in this area. So look for that. I would look for anybody who's in law enforcement, who's a member of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals.
Okay.
Because they're sprinkled all over the country. And, there's a lot of folks who are cops who are part of ATAP. There are prosecutors, there are, corporate security type folks, which brings me up to, if you work for a corporation that has a threat assessment unit, that can be really helpful, because you don't necessarily always need law enforcement to manage that case for you. Then you can work through your corporate threat assessment team.
That's a really good point. Yes, because to my point, yeah, you do a lot of different threat assessment, one of them being corporate,
Right.
Another one schools, like I mentioned, and then also the work that you've done for Katie. And I want to thank you both so much for coming on, because like I said, the victim doesn't know where it's going to end, right? And how scary it is. So again, that threat assessment, but then the management piece as well is so important. And it's so nice to know that someone like you, Randy, is out there doing the work that you're doing. Because in these situations with the post-separation abuse, this behavior just escalates and things start popping up that didn't even exist maybe in the marriage, as controlling as that was. And Katie, I want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing.
Absolutely.
And Katie, do you have any final advice for anyone out there listening today?
Oh, well, no, I mean, everything was covered. I've just been really appreciative of Randy. And I've just jumped into educating myself, reading Daniel DeBecker and a bunch of other things that he's given me, because I did identify with what Randy said, is sometimes the victims do feel alone and they're like the only ones that can manage. And if, we began to first learn that this is a thing, and probably a long-term thing, and then learn how to manage it ourselves in a small degree, that is a lot more empowering than just feeling helpless and like you have to be reactive all the time.
Absolutely. On the defense, constantly on the
Yes.
defense. And so, having some education and then also some tools that could help. I agree.
Right.
Much more empowering. And so thank you for the advice also, Randy, on people contacting their local domestic violence organization. And also just please, anyone out there that's suffering from this, research stalking. I know there's stalkingawareness.org. And they also have a stalking log, and I will be posting one on JackieMillerCoaching.com on my blog page, so that people can download those to help document those behaviors. And again, I want to thank you both for coming on, sharing your expertise and your experiences, and just letting people out there know that they're not alone.
My pleasure. Thanks for getting this message out there, Jackie. I appreciate that.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Randy. And thank you, Katie. All right. You guys take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.